Radio.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by Archival Revival. Archival Revival is the Christian Film Archive Company, and they're currently paying for vintage Christian films. Archival Revival is dedicated to preserving and restoring classic Christian films and media. So if you have original prints, negatives, or other film elements of classic Christian films, or if you have audio recordings, masters for classic Christian record albums, they want to buy them from you. This is a sponsor that wants to pay you money. Archival Revival. You can reach them at archival.revival@gmail.com. They also have a blog at archivalrevival.blogspot.com. So just so you understand, what they're looking for is vintage Christian films, 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, in those metal cases, the old stuff. So you might have a church or a youth center or something like that, a Christian center, and they're up in the attic, they're down in the basement, something like that. You have a pastor friend. Go out there, put on your gloves and your goggles and look around, your face mask. Look around for those old, dusty old vintage films. They're going to pay you for them, and they're going to preserve them, because these are professional guys that preserve films, and they want to do this it's for preservation, historical preservation. Archival.revival@gmail.com. Okay, we got a great guest today. Very excited about this. Anthony Meoli. And he's a criminal profiler. And has all kind of degrees in the therapy field. But what he's been doing is he's been talking to the D.C. sniper Lee Boyd Malvo. Okay, and we have a tape of Lee Boyd Malvo from prison for 20 minutes. We're going to be playing today in the second hour of the show. Mr. Meoli, are you there? Danny, do we have him? Do we have anybody?
Hello?
Oh, how are you, Anthony? How are you?
Good, how are you? Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. So, Anthony, tell us about yourself. Who is Anthony Meoli?
I'm a criminal profiler and forensic consultant. I've been writing, emailing, and personally visiting serial killers and murderers for close to 30 years at this point.
Really? Because you seem like a kind of a young guy. How old are you?
I'm 46 now, but I've been doing it for quite some time.
Okay, then great. So you've been doing this even before you went into the field professionally?
Yes.
Okay, fascinating. So this is probably what kind of got you interested in being a forensic consultant and a criminologist, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had some things that happened to me early in life that got me intrigued into why people do the things they do, which is sort of why I pursued, criminology, law, and forensic psychology.
And you also have like a therapist practice?
Yeah, I'm a therapist in Pennsylvania.
Okay, and what do you specialize in?
Pretty much whatever walks in the door. But,
okay, great.
So I'm a nationally certified counselor here in Pennsylvania.
Okay, before the show's over, let's see if you can do anything with me, okay? If you can help me with my issues. Now, we came here together today to talk about Lee Boyd Malvo and the case of the D.C. sniper, right? Because you wrote some books about this D.C. sniper case, right? How many books have you written about this?
Well, I wrote a book, Diary of the D.C. Sniper with Lee, in 2012, and then we also did interview with the D.C. Sniper where I did a 66-minute full-life audio interview with him. In conjunction, I've written multiple blogs and articles with Psychology Today and other forensic professionals regarding his case.
Now, when you say a diary of the D.C. sniper, this is actually Lee Boyd Malvo's actual 7-year-long diary that he wrote himself, correct?
Well, yeah. Well, to be specific, so our relationship really began in 2004, 2005 was the earliest that the letters started rolling in. And by the time the book came out, it would be about 7-8 years later. And the diary was, as you said, it was a handwritten diary, some 200 pages long, that he wanted transcribed verbatim, which I did, obviously making minor alterations when necessary. And I've had some people talk about the editing of the book, but people don't realize that, there was a certain formula that he wanted, and I kept to it, and that's the way it was. There was some semantics here and there that had to be changed. But other than that, the book is, 99%. If you were to pick up his personal diary, which sits in my basement, if you were to pick it up and read it and flip to a certain page, it would be as it is in the book, exactly. So
fascinating. Now for the people listening, they might be kind of young, in their 20s and stuff like that, 20s and 30s. That they aren't familiar with what the DC sniper case is. Can you give us some background on that?
Sure. It's now the interesting thing. I'm sure a lot of people remember September 11th, which happened obviously September 11th, 2001. The interesting thing about the D.C. sniper case, which happened in the Beltway, which is the Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland area, the Beltway area, that happened in October of 2002. So it was just 13 months after a nation that was reeling from, the worst domestic terrorist attack ever. And then we had this going on where we had random people being shot with no known motive all over the place. And so on the eastern seaboard, it gripped the country because nobody knew when and where the person was going to strike, and that's what sort of made it terrifying. We didn't know if it was another terrorist attack from Al-Qaeda or whether or not it was just some lone gunman or in this, what we came to know as a duo that was committing these crimes. Yeah,
at the time it was like a 24-hour news story. This is all they talked about, night after night after night, all day long. And there was even some theory that they saw like a white box van, and then they were stopping all white box vans and all over the place. In the official story with Lee Boyd Malvo and John Allen Muhammad, the official story, how many victims were there in the official story?
Well, the official, if you were to look up the case, let's say Wikipedia, which is what a lot of people get their information from, to get a quick source. But the actual case was that 10 people were murdered by Lee Boyd Malvo and John Allen Muhammad.
And that was in the D.C. area?
That was in the D.C. area. So that's pretty much what the case was. Lee Boyd Malvo took basically 6 of those murders to his credit and 4 were to John Allen Muhammad. But basically the 10 people were killed and 3 were critically injured, but they survived their wounds.
And from what I understand is they had taken a car and modified it so that they could lie down through the back seat and the trunk, and there was a hole that they could shoot through?
Yeah, it was actually a little more complex. A lot of the information is erroneous because they don't have the first-hand knowledge I had from the actual guy who pulled the trigger.
Right.
But how they got around, because they did get stopped, but how they got around the idea that there was nothing going on was they had actually purchased the car in New Jersey, and John wanted the Chevy Caprice because it was the kind of car that had a large trunk, it was easy to modify, and he had gotten the idea from an Irish Republican Army manual, which he had studied, when he was when he was in Bellingham, Washington, where this all began, but we could get to that later. But that's basically where it happened was they purchased the car from a contact who provided the car in central New Jersey. Then the car was sort of officially picked up in Camden, New Jersey, and then it became what everybody knew as Blue Caprice that eventually would be committing the crimes. And as you said, the reason why a lot of people were looking for the wrong vehicle was because an eyewitness after the Home Depot shooting said that they had seen a white truck that basically had no windows kind of thing, which is so many, that's just about every single painting truck on the planet.
Yeah.
And so that really delayed a lot of and people were looking for the wrong people. And it came to find out that that eyewitness was actually inside the store at the time that he made the statement. But by the time they found that out, the information was already out, and it was too late.
Now, this modified blue Caprice, did it have any kind of muffling for the noise of the gunfire?
No. Now, what's interesting, so it was actually twofold, because people think, well, they just drilled a hole into the rear of the trunk next to the license plate, but that's not the full story, because if you think about it, common sense, you wouldn't be able to see anything, because if you just drilled a hole, all you would do is be able to get a gun out, but you wouldn't be able to see what you were shooting.
Right.
So what they actually did was they had modified, it wasn't a really genius idea, but he had a shock cord that attached to the top of the trunk and the tire. And so what it was, they drilled a hole to the sort of the left of the license plate, if you will, and from the inside of the car, if you're looking out, so it's to the left. And then the idea was the shock cord would allow the trunk to go up 2 or 3 inches, but that's it, and then stop. But the reason for that was that cleared the room for the scope, because they had to be able to both see and shoot. So that all makes sense if you think about it, because a hole alone is not going to be, if anybody's ever shot a gun, obviously you have to see what you're shooting. So it allowed the person who was in the trunk, John would climb into the trunk, he would put his right elbow on a spare tire to give him some leverage, and then he would sort of use his head as he sort of, aimed where he needed to go, and the shock cord would stop the trunk from obviously popping up, and it would give him just enough to get the scope clear to give him a vision of what he was shooting. And, you're shooting an AR-15, it's not that difficult to hit a target. And so they would do that. As soon as the shot was fired, they would pull down the trunk with the shock cord. It would close. The gun was not sticking out but 3-4 inches at most. And unless you were actually physically next to the car itself provided the suppression.
Right.
So it acted like, its own muffler, if you will, for the gunshot. I mean, it was loud inside the car, but outside there was not much sound.
Did they have any ear protection?
According to Lee, no, they didn't. They used it. John had earplugs, like your kind of standard little, maybe 22, 20, 33 kind of decibel kind of thing, but nothing huge, because the idea was they had to be able to hear each other, and they also had to be able to get out of there quickly, and if something were to happen, they couldn't be standing around looking, with, big ear protection on. So it had to be relatively easy. It also had to be easy to discard without anybody noticing. So if and when they had the opportunity, they just had small earplugs to do it.
I tell you, the detail you have of this story is just incredibly fascinating. Now, did you actually see, evidence photos of what this car looked like with the modifications?
Well, I probably had better than that, because in my book, because I had a very, unique relationship with Lee for many years, I asked him if you would please draw for me exactly what the Caprice looked like. And so you can see it in the book, or you can find it online, probably, because at this point somebody has probably stolen my photograph. Right. But he provides an exact picture of exactly what the car looked like on the inside, including solar panels that they used to power the laptop. Because you have to remember, back in 2002, laptops were not like they are today 15 years later. So they had to use something to power the laptop, and they had a solar panel that they had sort of, modified to keep enough power in the laptop so that they could find escape routes while they were looking for spots. So it was sort of interesting how they had done, in this little car, there was quite a bit going on.
Wait, so and there wasn't Wi-Fi back then like we have today, so they must have had like a cell phone connected to the laptop, right?
That's how they did it. So basically you would have, Lee Malvo would be usually sitting in the front of the car. He would not be firing from the trunk. John would be doing that. And Lee shot from outside the car. On a few occasions, he did shoot from inside the car, but those were instances where people were injured and they were not killed. Lee apparently was a better shot when he was open, but it also put him obviously at more risk because he was outside of the car. And so one might surmise that maybe John had a lot of power over Lee in putting him in that position. But Lee also had the opportunity to turn the gun on John if he wanted to. If he really wanted to not be part of this, he could have easily either dropped the gun and run. He could have done a million different things rather than take a shot. So I think, once he stepped outside the vehicle with the weapon, he was removed from the danger. He had the gun that was, being used to kill people.
Right.
And instead of choosing to, turn the gun on John if he so wanted to, he instead rather pulled the trigger to injure or kill people.
Now, again, back to the official story, the story that we all hear, forget these movies and stuff, but the official story in court. What was their motive for doing this?
Well, the idea was sort of twofold. It was a hidden motive because John Allen Muhammad's ex-wife had control of their children. And so John had been separated from her, and she had sort of been pretty smart in the way that she had sort of a network of friends who they knew he was in the country. They knew he came from Antigua to Bellingham, Washington, and she got word of that. And so she moved around the country because she did not want him to, she knew that she was going to be hurt by him. So you can look at this as two possible things. There's, the alleged idea that this was a, sort of a copycat crime where they followed the idea of the Matrix, which Lee mentions in my interview that, they had watched together 300 times, and John had sold him on the idea that everybody was part of this system, and that this system was broken. And the idea was anyone was the enemy who was not part of the system that John wanted. So that's why you had numerous people, men, women, even children, 13 years old, being shot. The idea was that it didn't matter who it was, that everybody was a part of the problem unless and until they had achieved their goals. So there was really a two-pronged thing because John was also circling back to Louisiana where he believed at the time his wife was with the children. So although it's sort of difficult to know what happens because they were arrested October 24th, 2002 in Myersville, Maryland, on their way heading south to North Carolina, it's difficult to know where they were actually intending to go because we don't, the story never really unfolded because they got caught. So it's sort of a two-pronged motive. John hands Lee a story about everybody is the enemy, but he also knows, including Lee, that at the end of the game, the idea was to get back to Mildred. My particular opinion was that this was all a red herring, and the idea would be that multiple people would be killed by random crimes, and then when Mildred gets shot, it would appear as if she just happened to be, another victim of the DC snipers or whoever it might be at the time, and they would get away with the crime, and he would get, custody of the children. That was my gut reaction of how that was supposed to work, but it just never came to fruition because they got caught.
Yeah, I believe that's Mildred's public theory, too, as well. She thought the whole thing was directed toward her, and it was a copycat. I mean, not copy, you know what I mean? Like you know what I mean? Like the other ones were just to confuse things, to make it look random.
Right. It became, because you had, the shootings began on October 2nd, and they ended on October 22nd before they started fleeing. Now, there was a three-pronged thing that was supposed to happen where they were supposed to go to, and I can go into that if you wanted to, in North Carolina, they were going to do some pretty heinous things where they were going to, kill a policeman, and then they were going to bomb the funeral, and then they were going to replicate the idea of what they were doing with other children at this alleged farm. after they got the ransom demand that they were going to do. Again, none of that came to fruition, so we don't know how much of that may or may not be true.
Let me ask you a question. How did Lee and John wind up together? How did these two find each other?
Well, it's as complex and as simple as it might be, but I'll go into it. So Lee was born in Jamaica, and he and John got to know each other through his mother. So John actually helped Lee's mom get into the United States illegally into Florida. John made his money in Antigua by getting people illegally into the country of the United States. That was sort of how he made his money. He wasn't the good guy who handed out, candy and stuff to people in Antigua like Lee portrays. He was actually a pretty bad guy who did bad things for most of his life. And his job was basically, in a way, human trafficking is really what he was doing.
Right.
But he gets Lee's mom, her name is Una, he gets her into the country. But during one of his other times, while he is in the United States, the immigration INS detains John for a few days, for maybe 90 days. And the reason being is one of the girls he was trying to sneak in, her accent did not quite match what he had on the paperwork. And so the INS people had some questions and said, something doesn't seem right about this whole thing. So they sent the girl back, and they kept John, but they didn't have a whole lot, because John's papers were in order. John, everything was okay with him. The only thing was he was not a U.S. citizen, so they deported him back to Antigua. But in the 90 days while he was in Florida, Lee Boyd Malvo was actually taking care of his affairs. He was doing everything that John was doing, all of his illegal paperwork, all the documents, passports, all the stuff that he had learned from John. So you have to remember the nefarious activities he was teaching Lee prior to this whole thing, just because of the relationship that his mother had with John. They just happened to be friends. So it was not really, yes, he was a father figure, but we have to go back further because they actually knew each other long before this crime occurred. So when he comes back to Antigua, and Lee had taken care of his finances, hidden some of the money that he told him to hide so that the INS did not take it, he said, "Thank you, son." And Lee says at that time it was a bonding moment for him because his own father had abandoned him at an early age. And so John provided that, fatherly figure, if you will. And from that point on, he said, "I would do anything for that man, including killing." So that's basically how that all came about.
Now, what age was Lee at that time? When he was doing all this passport stuff? And
John, when he first met John?
Yeah, when he was doing all this illegal passport work and stuff like that. Because if he was 17 during these crimes, he
would be about 16.
Fascinating. So a 16-year-old kid, he must be a smart guy then, 16 years old, to be doing fake passports and phoning up documents and immigration papers?
Yeah, I mean, he's well-read. He spent a lot of his time bouncing around to different schools, but he was always on top of his homework. His mom had developed a beating formula for him that if he did not get an A for everything below that, he would be beaten 5 times.
Wow.
And so, and that went for any homework assignment he ever got. Una was extremely strict about the fact that he had to do well in school because that was the only way out of their situation. And Una was a hard-working person. She had developed her own little store and tried to – it was like a clothing store, whatever she could to make things, to make ends meet. But at the same time, she didn't have a lot of time for Lee. So she would pass Lee around to relatives who were in different cities. And so Lee rarely had a lot of stability, the kind of stability that most people take for granted. Lee and his father had abandoned him by the age of 6. His mom had pretty much abandoned him by the age of 13, with the exception of showing up here and there to, sort of show her face as being his mother. It wasn't much. So yeah, as you said, I mean, he was street smart, but he also had a lot of anger long before this ever brewed about. So he had a lot of hatred towards other people, especially his mom and his father. Whenever you have inner hatred towards your own parents, I mean, I don't need to tell you about all the serial killers, spree killers, and other people where that case has shown itself again and again. I mean, there was one thing that Freud got right is how important, childhood development is. But that was the start of it. I mean, that's how a young mind got started, a criminal mind. So he was very street smart.
And later on, when we're playing the audio tape that you have with Lee Boyd Malvo from prison, we have a recording of you speaking to Lee Boyd Malvo, where he's admitting to these additional murders. He brings up all this stuff about his relationship with his mother, and at 13 years old, this was an important part of his life. But now, at around 16 or 17, somehow he winds up in the custody of John Muhammad. And how did that come about? The mother just was okay with that?
Well, no. They had actually traveled from Bellingham, Washington, to visit her. And again, it's covered in pretty good detail in my book. But there was a very fine moment to where they met with Una and told her that basically there was a choice that Lee had to make, and Lee's choice was either to go back to his mother or to stay with John Allen Muhammad. It was sort of Lee's choice. And Lee decided, I mean, it's a little bit of a long story in that respect, but to put it briefly, he chose John over his own mother. But largely because she had physically beaten him for many years. And John did not. John did not beat Lee in any form or fashion, regardless of what he said at trial. He never admitted in any form, whether it was in our interview, whether it was in the book, in his actual handwritten diary, in all the years of correspondence, never once did he say that John Allen Muhammad beat me. So I have to disagree with, he had said one time in 2012 that he was sexually molested, but yet, I think that was just him blustering off steam and trying to have, that self-pity from, because at the time he was, again, going to court and possibly having his case reviewed. And so, Lee's very smart. Lee knows how to take advantage of the system, and he knows that he can get pity from some people, but I think people need to look deeper into his case and listen to exactly what it is he's saying and how he's saying it, and make their minds up for themselves as to whether he's actually learned his lesson.
So when he came into when he started traveling with John Muhammad, there was no official custody or child support or anything like that. It was just an informal arrangement. Okay, you could take my son.
That's basically it. I mean, now, what John did, of course, what did he have experience with doing was he had experience with doing fraudulent documents.
Right.
So he made Lee look like if they got stopped, as they did in Virginia, when they got stopped and the police stopped them because it was they had been fallen asleep in a parking lot during the shootings. And again, the Chevy Caprice was not a car that was on the, on the docket for anybody to be looking for. It was just a cop who had stopped them and questioned them. But the odd thing was you had a man who had a Washington State driver's license, but a New Jersey plate car. And so when the car comes back clean, there's no crimes tied to the car. And John, again, obtained all the information somewhat illegally through his friend in New Jersey to sort of get the car clean. He makes Lee look like he's his son in, basic paperwork. I mean, your minor child's not going to be carrying anything on him, but he calls him his son to the police officer and explains him that this is my son. And so the cop really thinks nothing of it further. There's no real hit out for John Allen Muhammad at the time. So he lets them go. And, that would be a mistake that, again, I wouldn't hold it against the cop for doing so. He had no reason to really suspect them, you know.
Couple of questions. Now, is that his real official name that he always used, John Allen Muhammad?
John Allen Muhammad, yeah, that's his official name.
And is he Muslim? Did he change his name to become Muslim, or was he always Muslim?
Well, so this is, again, where it gets sort of murky, because there's three stories going. You have John Allen Muhammad, who adopts he adopts the Nation of Islam, okay? So the Nation of Islam promotes a very specific way in which the religion is to be, I should say, followed. And one of those aspects in the Nation of Islam is if you are with, in John's case, he was actually dating a white woman, and Lee, in my interview, if somebody buys it or listens to it, Lee talks specifically about how he was offended by the fact that John had preached the Nation of Islam, made him listen to Farrakhan incessantly, and he said, after all that, you're dating a white woman. And so Lee makes him break off the relationship. So I find it interesting that, this is someone who is so embroiled into this idea that they have to follow this religion that he makes his own alleged master break off the engagement. And so that's sort of how it was. Their religion, if you wanted to put it one, was actually Nation of Islam. So yes, it was a Muslim sect of Islam, but the Nation of Islam.
Okay.
It's a lot to take in, I know.
No, not at all. The reason I'm curious about this is because a friend of mine worked at, I think it was the Holiday Inn there in that area, and they had Muhammad's name before they found the car. Somehow they had his name, but they had 3 different versions of his name that they were typing into the computer to see if he had checked into any of these hotels in that area. And then later on, I went to a PI convention, and it was the company IRB that said that it was their database that the cops were using to search down his name. So I guess somehow but he had 3 versions of the name, which wasn't too uncommon. Yeah.
So what happens is, Muhammad itself, the name, is the problem with is the name was often Mohammed, Mohammad, or MAD, just one M. So his name appeared many ways, and often people would take his name and put their own spelling to it. But I mean, he was born. His born name was John Allen Williams, but he took on, which is common. He took the name John Allen Muhammad as his Muslim name, but he held that name for quite some time.
Thank you very much. Okay, that clarifies a lot for me too. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry if I didn't clarify that. So he took that. I was thinking about it at the time he was arrested. So he was born John Allen Williams, and then when he joined the Nation of Islam in 1987, that's when he adopted. So he had that name for quite some time, since 1987.
Now, and you said he had these connections with these guys, like when he purchased the car, that they were able to manipulate the paperwork. So he had like underworld criminal connections?
He apparently had lots of underworld connections, according to Lee, because he had worked in gun running.
Okay.
That's where they made a lot of their money. They would meet in New Mexico, in Arizona, in various places, and do deals where he would meet some pretty nasty guys, sometimes alone, sometimes with Lee, but a lot of times these deals were done without Lee present. But that's where a lot of the money came to fund the purchases of the stockpile of weapons, the explosives that they had in North Carolina that they were planning to use. And again, they were, if the master plan is to be true, that we're supposed to believe, they were going to develop a farm where they would have children, much like Lee, to sort of teach them exactly the same thing that Lee went through. And they would replicate exactly what they did across the country, where they would randomly go about and cause chaos. And chaos is the only way to change any existing system. So it was a somewhat delusional belief that you had to buy into, but that's the story.
Very, very ambitious too. It's going to be a farm.
It was quite an undertaking.
Yeah. Now, what about? I forgot to ask you before when he was importing these young. You mentioned a young girl from Antigua into the country. Was there any sex trafficking involved in that human trafficking?
Well, I don't have specific information about it. I mean, I would have to say that it would not be. I would have to say it would be hard to imagine that it did not occur.
Okay.
I cannot confirm. So I cannot confirm or deny specifically, but I would say that we know that he was willing to take children from Antigua to the United States illegally. Anytime you're willing to do that, obviously you're putting a very marginalized child or adolescent at extreme risk. So knowing and willingly being able to do that, I would have to assume the person has very little care for the well-being of the person that they're doing this alleged favor for.
Yeah, very low moral threshold, yeah. Now, you mentioned before that they were doing...
I mean, it's pretty interesting to know that, Muhammad actually provided security during the Million Man March in 1995. I mean, that's how... and the Million Man March, that's where Farrakhan had, sort of come out and explained how he had, chosen to distance himself from the Nation of Islam at that time. But, the idea was it showed you how ingrained he was into this idea.
Now, that's interesting. Now, is this public knowledge, though, that he was this? Because when I looked on Wikipedia earlier, I didn't see anything about the Nation of Islam.
Yeah. I mean, he was a big follower of the Nation of Islam.
Now, when he was good.
I mean, this went on probably. Again, he had changed his name formally. Probably, I would say in early 2001, but he had been a member of the Nation of Islam since 1987. I mean. His grandfather and his aunt raised him. So.
Oh, really? Now
Muhammad also did not have a mother and father figure as well. So they both had this deep-seated sort of hatred towards their parents.
Now, what about Lee Boyd Malvo? Today, the last time you had contact with him, at least while he's in prison in the current period of time, is he still a member of the Nation of Islam?
Lee has adopted actually what I would consider more of a almost like a Buddhist type of lifestyle. He meditates a lot. He performs a lot of yoga. He is in a cell in Red Onion State Prison in what is considered the Delta unit, which is the highest level security unit there. I think most of that is largely for his own protection. He's not a very large man. He's 32 years old now, but he's not a very big man. I visited him at Red Onion before the release of my book in 2012, and he's not a very foreboding figure. He's not a very big man, but he would be a target at Red Onion State Prison for other prisoners. So he's kept at this secure wing where he does have a window in his cell, but he can't really see out of it. It's sort of like frosted glass. And he spends a lot of his time meditating. And if there was a specific type of religion, I mean, I would have to say it's probably still Muslim. I can't say for sure if it's a Nation of Islam.
Okay.
I probably have to ask Lee for that.
I don't think he's going to talk to me after this. Okay, maybe I'll give it a try. Maybe I'll take up where you left off. Now, pick up your mantle. By the way, all this stuff you could find in our guest Anthony Meoli's books, man. Diary of a DC Sniper, and there's a recording of interview of a DC Sniper. This is great stuff that I don't think I've heard this anywhere else. Now, you mentioned that they were going back and forth to Arizona, New Mexico, doing these arms deals and stuff like that, like a gun running. And I suppose they were doing like everyone does. They went to the gun shows, and then they were bringing up where the states are more difficult to get guns. Now, were those contacts in those different states, were they Nation of Islam?
again, the information about the gun running is what I would say anecdotal from Lee through our conversations. I would say that because, I mean, I would have to say that because John was, again, with the exception of his girlfriend, he did not like white people. He hated white people. That would, like I have mentioned on numerous phone calls that are not like the one we're going to hear tonight. I mean, hatred was not even a strong enough word that he had for Caucasian men and women. He just did not like the race of Caucasians at all. So the likelihood that he would engage in a business act with anyone other than those who he followed, I think, as a behavioral analyst myself, I don't foresee him doing that. It was probably somebody who he was comfortable with, who he had done dealings with, or who had been sort of, vetted out by people who he knew through, his own religion.
Now, is that public information about these arms deals he was doing across the country and this gun running? Is that common knowledge? Because I don't think I saw anything about that on Wikipedia either. Or is that just... You're
probably not going to find a lot of that information on Wikipedia. You're probably not going to find information about what people are about to hear at all.
Well, the tape you have, no one's heard. I think just you and me, pretty much, right? Okay.
Probably.
Yeah. Now, we're even speculating that even the judge who just reduced his sentence probably is not aware of this information.
I mean, what sort of strikes me is that Lee has admitted some things, but not, I think, to the degree where I don't think the public has heard Lee in this manner, and then going through the specificity that we're going to hear later on.
But he did have a conversation with William Shatner from Star Trek. Or T.J. Hooker, I guess you might want to say in this case. How did he come into contact with William Shatner and have this conversation?
Well, at the time, William Shatner was doing interviews with. It was a short-lived series, but he did. I think it was even called like Interviews with William Shatner or something like that. And he just happened to strike up a relationship with someone who knew Lee, and they worked out. There wasn't any money exchange because Lee could not receive any money, but they talked. They talked about the cases, and they talked a little bit about his involvement in other crimes outside of what we know as the Beltway sniper attacks. But it was again, it was not as specific as what we hear here, nor was it as specific as correcting the numbers, because what I often do when I talk to 5 serial killers a week across the country on average. And I've been doing that for years. And I take their calls and I listen to them. And one of the things I've learned is often when I purposely mention something that is wrong, their personality, somebody who is narcissistic, somebody who is extremely, they want credit for what they did. If you purposely tell them the wrong information, they will be very sure to correct you. And so often I will give them erroneous information to hopefully get at least the facts from their mouth. Because people have always said, well, how do you know that the inmate is telling you the truth? I don't, but I have the inmate saying it rather than some textbook. So I would rather get them on record as saying the information and then have investigators or other people look at the information and say, okay, this is, whether or not this is true or not, I don't know, but let's investigate it, because I trust words of the individual themselves rather than the Associated Press, who never contacted him, never wrote to him, never emailed him, never wrote a book with him, never had a 66-minute interview with him about his full life, and never visited him in person. So my relationship with Lee is probably closer than 99.9% of the public. So I trust in myself, and I trust in the information that the inmate's going to give me. And if the inmate, hands me erroneous information, well, it's up to me, like you as an investigator, you want to get to the truth. But I need to start with something, and I start with the inmate.
I'm glad you bring that up because it's so infuriating, and I'm sure you deal with the same thing. Because cases I've worked on personally, where I know the people involved personally, I have my own personal reporting, and then someone online or the internet or someone will say, "Well, look at this article. You're wrong. Look at this article from someone else." And I'm like, "Oh my God," And I've worked on so many high-profile cases where half the stuff you read in the papers is totally wrong, not even close. So I appreciate you bringing that up, man, because it can be so infuriating. But back to...
I've had a lot of people correct me, and they said, well, Lee never did this, or Lee, and I'm like, have you ever listened to my interview? I'm like, you can literally download it in 30 seconds and listen to him go through his entire life, and I'm like, he will tell you exactly what I just told you, so I don't know where you may or may not have heard of it, but I'm getting the information from Lee Boyd Malvo himself.
Yeah.
So again, like you said, I do get infuriated. Even like when I watch movies, like when Blue Caprice came out, I was shocked that not a single soul contacted me about the movie, and I'm watching the movie and like, this is completely incorrect information. But, people are going to, whatever sells, I guess. But I prefer to go with the truth and then work from there rather than, I would rather people hear the raw, unedited information and say, wow, that's some pretty powerful stuff. I didn't know that because you're getting to hear it from the actual source. From the very moment the conversation begins, you get to hear it from the source, which is something that's pretty rare.
There's so much great, true, like the interview we're doing right now, there's so much great, true information. Like, why not just explore this and delve into this rather than just the fact that this guy's mixed up with the Nation of Islam, all this great stuff. But anyway, let's get back. And you can find this stuff, too, by the way, An Interview of a D.C. Sniper and Diary of a D.C. Sniper by Anthony Meoli. How do you spell your last name, Anthony?
It's M as in Mary, E-O, L as in Larry, I as in Indigo.
And you can find it on iTunes, you can find it on Amazon, and we're going to have a link at the Opperman Report bookstore and OppermanReport.com. You can find it there. And even on the blog, too. I'll have it on the blog. Now, we talked before, you mentioned something about them having a cache of weapons. Now, where were these weapons stored, and what was the volume of these weapons?
Well, I mean, as we know, they had a Bushmaster weapon with them. But they had a cache of 9mm, 38s, 45s. Again, most of the information, I mean, I hate to keep referring back to my interview, but Lee detailed every single weapon that they had, that they were able to shoot. Most of these were kept in Washington, but a few of them were stored in North Carolina, where they were intending to do a lot of further damage.
And you said, where were they stored at? In a storage locker or at somebody's house?
It was sort of a storage locker.
Okay, and also, too, you mentioned, too, they were traveling back and forth across the country doing his gun running. Were they staying at motels? Were they staying in cars? Or were they staying at people's homes? Do you know?
No, they would be staying at a local hotel. Whatever, we're not talking, a five-star hotel. It would be whatever would be feasible. That was around, and then they would make their trip back to Bellingham. They also did a lot of deals where they would rob Home Depot-like stores back before I would say things got very, very automated. They had operated in the Bellingham, Washington area where they would take receipts from items that they had already returned, and they were able. They would like fill another empty box, and you know how like if you go into a Home Depot, often they're very busy, and they sort of trust you. You give them a receipt, and they're like, okay, and they provide cash or credit based on what it was. So they would often replicate these receipts and go into stores and often hand in boxes that had almost nothing in them at all. They would put something in the box, but it would not be anything. They would just replicate the receipt that they had, and they would get cash, and they would rob these stores, 3-4 times for the same item, and then they did this over and over again. It was sort of surprising that they got away with it, but in my own experience, I could actually see even today how it's possible. You could fill up a box if you had a receipt and give it to Home Depot. By the time they open it, it's already too late. You have their money. And if you're a criminal, you don't care. But if you're a law-abiding person like yourself who has scruples, you're not going to do that.
Yeah, that's still a very common shoplifting crime. Like heroin addicts and drug addicts, meth addicts will they do that all day long. Yeah, they're still doing that. Now, you mentioned explosives. What kind of explosives did they get, and how did they get them?
Well, again, these explosives were allegedly obtained from these nefarious type of people that they met along the way, including C4 type explosives. And what the idea was, after the chaos that they created in the Beltway area, when they were caught in Myersville, Maryland, which is not far, it's a day's drive to North Carolina, it's hours away, it's not far. The idea was they were heading there to get the whole cache of weapons that was there, along with the explosives, to head back to Washington, the core of the nation. They were going to do it in D.C., and the horrible thing that they had planned was this three-stage plan. And the first plan was they were going to kill an officer. And I don't know if your listeners are, it's a sort of graphic, but I'll explain if it's okay what they were going to do.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So what Lee was going to do was, because he was a fairly innocent-looking man, he would just walk up to a cop who was sitting in his car. He would shoot him. They would take the car. He would shoot him right in the head, kill him instantly. They would take the cop car to a location where they had already pre-planned it out. They were going to decapitate the police officer and leave his head on the seat. The police would be so upset and outraged, and of course they would leave their tarot card type of calling card, so they knew it was the DC snipers who did this. The idea was that anybody, including the police now, are not even safe, but the gravity of knowing that they had done this decapitation, and then that was the first, that graphic nature that's the first thing. When the policeman is then given a funeral a few days later, and there was tons of police marching, that's when the explosives were going to go off. And then a second set of explosives were going to go off when secondary responders would come, because to help the police who had just been injured from the first explosion. So that was stage 2. The stage 3 would be that they would ask for $10 million in order to stop this rampage, because it would only get worse. Because if we're willing to do this to a cop and blow up responders, et cetera, and you still can't catch us, just imagine what we can do. And so this idea of this ransom of $10 million was going to be used to fund this farm to do exactly what they had already done, but replicate it with other children and other adults who bought into this idea of chaos. And so that's some pretty heavy stuff. But that was all part of their plan.
Did they have a plan on how they were going to get this money? Do the money drop, $10 million, like a truckload of cash? How would they pull that off?
You and I know, whether it's movies or reality, ransom drops rarely go well.
Right.
Very, very rarely do ransoms pan out well for anybody, because it's unless you put it in some unnamed Swiss account that's wired. And but John, of course, did have access to, people, places, and things, especially in Antigua, where maybe, he could have found a place that would have been willing to, have that account open for him and been able to access the money. I highly doubt that any government, especially Washington, D.C., would have given in to this $10 million demand, but that's what their plan was going to be.
Now, you mentioned that they were going to start this farm with like-minded individuals. Did they have like-minded individuals that they knew, or this was a plan in the future that was just going to attract them later on?
No, this was one of John's many delusions.
Well, we got a commercial break.
You understand though, at this point
Wait,
before,
Anthony, we got a commercial break. We got a commercial break. That's okay. We're with Anthony Meoli, fascinating guy, criminal profiler and a forensic consultant. He's written these books about the D.C. Sniper, Interview of D.C. Sniper, and Diary of a D.C. Sniper. We'll be back with more of Anthony Meoli after these messages. And now a word from our sponsors. Archival Revival, the Christian Film Archive, is currently paying for vintage Christian films. They are dedicated to preserving and restoring classic Christian films and media. So if you have an original prints, negatives, or other film elements of classic Christian films, or you have audio recording masters for classic Christian record albums, they want to buy them from you. So email archival.revival@gmail.com and they're going to make you an offer. Archival Revival wants to preserve these classic Christian films so that they continue saving people for years. These films have brought people to salvation. They want to continue that. Their staff has decades of experience in handling and preserving of film elements, and they utilize the very best climate-controlled film storage facilities around the world. Contact them today at archival.revival@gmail.com. If there's someone you know has these prints, negatives, recording masters, or other materials from vintage Christian films, you can check out their blog at archivalrevival.blogspot.com. Now, just so you understand, Archival Revival wants to pay you for these films. So you can look in your church attic, in the church basement. If you have a friend who runs a Christian youth ministry or these youth vacation Bible study camps, they have these old films in those big metal containers, 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter. Archival Revival wants to buy them from you. So this is a sponsor that actually wants to give you money. And all you have to do is contact them, tell them what you have. If you're in the UK or Ireland or Africa, these films are all over the world, and they're gathering dust, and they're going to deteriorate if they don't get into the hands of Archival Revival. So that's archival.revival@gmail.com, or the blog spot is archivalrevival.blogspot.com. Don't forget, this show is brought to you by pscoco.com. Phoebe Sod is an independent curator with the Cocoa Exchange. The Cocoa Exchange is formerly known as Dove Chocolate Discoveries, and they make the finest silky smooth chocolate because the products start with the best cocoa beans, which are tested for quality and flavor by expert technicians. The Cocoa Exchange offers not just premium chocolates, but anything from sauces and spices to brownie and cake mixes, and even coffee and martini mixes. If you wish to treat yourself or someone you love to a sweet and tasty gift, then the Cocoa Exchange is the brand for you. So you go to pscoco.com, you click on the Shop Now button. You can see all their beautiful chocolates. You can order it right now tonight. It could be in your mailbox in a couple of days. Or if you want to get into the chocolate business, you want to be a chocolatier just like Phoebe Sod, you can click the Contact Us button, and you can learn how to get your own website, go into the cocoa chocolate business, and sell chocolate and make a little bit of money there. Remember, all these shows on Awake are brought to you by emailrevealer.com. You can go to emailrevealer.com and get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. But you also do all the kind of different services for you. An online dating service investigation. It's called an online infidelity investigation. And that's where you give us your husband or your boyfriend, your girlfriend's email address, and we trace it back to their online dating websites, and we return a list of all the dating sites that email is registered to. We can expand on that investigation and trace it back to porn sites, escort service sites, swinger sites, even gambling websites, and even prescription drug websites. If you think your ex-husband or something is addicted to prescription medication or involved in a extreme online pornography addiction, we can produce a report for you that you can use in court. Adoption investigations. If you want to locate your birth parents or your birth child you gave away for adoption, we can do adoption investigations for you. Asset searches for you. Locate bank accounts, hidden assets, hidden properties, hidden income, all different kinds of services in the asset search investigation. Email tracing. If you need to locate or identify somebody from just an email address, we can do an email trace investigation for you. And all kinds of digital forensics, computer and cell phone digital forensics, where we can recover deleted content from an email or a hard drive and produce a report for you that you can use in court. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can contact me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com.
Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. We are here today with Anthony Meoli, fascinating guy. I'm going to beg this guy to come back because he's talking to 5 serial killers a week. We got to get this guy back. But today we're talking about the interview of a DC sniper, which you could find on iTunes and Amazon, and also Diary of a DC Sniper, which you can also find on Amazon. Anthony, before we get back to and we listen to this tape, give us a quick rundown of some of the other topics, because I know I asked you briefly about what was it named, Glen Rogers, right?
Right.
And you just went for an hour, right? You were telling me about Glen Rogers for an hour. So don't take an hour now, but just give us an idea of some of the other cases you're familiar with and some of the other guys you're talking to.
Well, right now I am writing a book with Ronald Lee White, who was one of the most, probably the most vicious serial killer in Colorado. Not a well-known name like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who's in Colorado, but Lieutenant Joe Kenda, who's the homicide hunter, which is one of the biggest shows on TV. He said of all the 400 homicides that he investigated, that Ronald Lee White's case was the single worst. And I've gotten to know Ron very well, and in a very similar manner, he sent me very much the same, his life story that he wants to tell. So we're going to be writing that book this year. Phillip Carl Jablonski is another well-known serial killer in California. I'm doing a formal interview, much like I did with Malvo, with him. And I speak to several other serial killers, murderers, arsonists, even financial crimes, to sort of just round out my knowledge of the criminal mind, because, again, I can read 1,000 books, but I can learn probably as much in one phone call from these guys as all those books combined, because they're teaching me, because I don't think that way. I don't think in the way that a killer would think, and it helps me learn when I look at a crime scene, or if I look at a photograph, this kind of thing would be possible because of this reason. This is something that I've heard, or I've seen. I've talked to people who've committed these crimes. It gives me a little, what I would call, criminal intelligence that I normally would not have, because, these academic books are written by PhDs who have never done what I do. They don't immerse themselves this deeply into the life and crimes of individuals. And so, that's sort of how I go about doing it. So those are some of the things that I'm working on.
And what are some of the other famous serial killers you've been talking to?
Well, Daniel Rolling, who was a Gainesville Ripper in Florida, we wrote for many years. I visited him. Loran Cole, same thing. He's in Florida. Glen Rogers, I visited 10 times. I got to know him very well. He wrote to me maybe 3-4 times a week for 5 years. He's very well known because of his possible link to the O.J. Simpson case, which was brought about largely by myself. And there's a lot more to the story than people might believe, but, again, that can be something investigated further down the road. And there's some John Orr, who's the most prolific arsonist in American history. I talked to him. Actually, I'll probably be talking to him tomorrow night. So there's a lot of guys who I talked to, and Isaac Zamora, who I actually have an interview out, and Kenneth Bianchi, the Hillside Strangler, who I have another interview out with him as well on iTunes. So some of the most famous, infamous criminals, I build a relationship with them, but I want your listeners to know that when I do my recordings, it's with their full consent.
Right.
And when I do their books, I mean, I have U.S. copyrights, which are very difficult to obtain. A lot of people don't do that. You have to show written, oral proof that you have the permission to do what you do. So it's not just me sort of sneaking in and being able to do this. I get their permission on each and every phone call, and often date and time the phone call, so it sort of gives it context, because that's important. It's important to know, the conversation I could have had with Malvo could have been from 2005. You wouldn't know it. But if it's on the record, when I'm saying it, it lets your listeners know, okay, this is 10 years after the crime occurred that this conversation is taking place. If remorse had set in, it should have been set in by now. So it's the kinds of things where I think, time and place, all that kind of stuff is important to give your listeners context.
Absolutely. Now, before we get to the tape, I just have one more quick question for you, because in my work, when I'm talking, it's so stressful talking to my clients and stuff like that, and even some of the interviews I do, and I feel like I'm having like a little PTSD. Do you experience that when you talk to these some of the most horrific people on the face of the earth, walking around the earth right now? You're talking to them routinely. Does it affect you?
I would probably have to say it would be strange if it didn't affect me.
Yeah.
I mean, as a therapist myself, I mean, I do what they consider self-care. You have to, I see a therapist myself. I'm not going to hide from it, and I'm sort of proud of the profession. 3-4 times a year, I talk about those things that may or may not bother me. I'm not going to provide my therapist names for obvious reasons, but I think it's important. Every person I know who investigates these crimes, detectives, next week in St. Louis, we're doing one of the biggest cold case conventions in the entire country on the behavioral chair on that particular committee. And again, most of those people see a therapist on a routine basis because you need to get that information out.
Yeah.
Because it's some heavy stuff.
It sure is. I'm working on something right now, like all morning, and then right after this interview, I got to get back to work. It's just so overwhelming sometimes. Now, but one question in my notes here before we get back to the tape and stuff like that is you mentioned something about a tarot card calling card that they were using. Can you describe that?
Well, when they started to shoot in the Beltway area, they needed to have something to where they wanted to let people know. Of course, like I was saying, a lot of these serial killers and people who perpetrate these crimes, they want credit for it. Well, if John was working toward this idea of letting people know, the idea was, although the crimes were of various cultures, various races, various ages, he wanted to let people know, hey, that these tarot cards would let them know that the killers were all the same. These are all tied to the same person. So they started leaving the tarot card, and it said, hey, Mr. Police, I am God. Basically that let them know, hey, this is the same person committing these crimes. So after a while, they started leaving the tarot cards after the shootings to let them know for sure that this was who committed the crime.
And at one point, the police were communicating to them via TV using a code word or something. Are you familiar with what was going on with that?
Well, yeah, the police issued sort of they put it out to the public. They really suffered with the decision of whether or not to put out something to the public to let people know that they could contact them, and so they gave them sort of an idea where they could call a private line, and only it was their way of sort of vetting out. Now, other people would call, but the idea was that only the person who knew about these crimes would be able to, tell them. And so they called the police line, and that's the voice that you hear is actually Lee Boyd Malvo calling in to these lines. John Allen Muhammad did not make those phone calls. So you hear the very same voice you're about to hear making the phone calls back in 2002, which is sort of interesting.
So describe to us what we're going to hear on this recording right now.
Well, what you're going to hear, again, is a call that was placed 10 years after these crimes took place. So, again, we have to put context to this time frame. And the reason why I thought it was important to do that was we had heard a lot about this resentencing that Lee Malvo may get because of his erroneous sentence that he received of 6 life sentences without parole. At the time, when I made this recording, it had sort of stayed, private to me because Lee had said, the information had been relayed to the FBI. But like you had said, I had never heard anything about this from anyone anywhere. I had not read about it. I had not heard about the specific states he mentioned. I did not hear about the specific, even where he talks about specific areas where multiple crimes were committed and people die. And then what you're going to hear, and what I think the whole reason why I think people need to hear this is because what you're going to hear is that specific area where he talks about the amount of murders, and that's not nearly as shocking as what he does while he's talking about the number of people who died. The callous nature in which he is laughing while correcting my number.
All right.
That's the kind, and it's a few times where he's laughing about the incorrect data that I have, that there's even more people than is known, more people than even he's told anybody else. The information, as, like you mentioned before about Muhammad, I've never heard anybody talk about 70 murders. And you're going to hear Lee Boyd Malvo say just these kind of figures on this recording, which to me is shocking. You're also going to hear some information that, again, I never heard about, a possible, a person in Florida who was affiliated in politics who was allegedly almost assassinated by the D.C. snipers, which, again, is shocking information that I never heard about, and I don't know how far that investigation went. Lee said that the guy survived. I don't know if a shot was ever taken, but there appeared to be a plot to where a political assassination was going to take place. So maybe it puts some credibility towards the fact that, maybe they were murderers for hire at one time. He had also said, if you do some research, that a murder in Arizona was a murder for hire. So this would be the second time where these guys were committing a crime for money. Now, is this Lee Boyd Malvo talking, flamboyantly and to make himself more bigger than he really is? Well, if that's the case, 10 years removed from his, it makes him even more dangerous, in my opinion. I hopefully, it's my hope that even if his sentence is remanded down and he's resentenced, people realize, he was 17. He was 114 days from being 18. He was not 14 at the time. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it 6 times on his own volition. But what he's saying is there's a lot more crimes than we ever knew, and I think that's what everybody needs to hear.
Yeah, you can join the Marines at 17 years old, so people should realize that. Okay, so go to a Marine Corps training base and call them little boys. See how that works out for you. Okay, let's
Well, that works.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Danny, are you ready? Let's play there. Let's go to the videotape. Danny Romero.
came to me like, look here, if you take, you got this boat, 36 foot, you got this storage for the back, you got this box, we're going to get $14,000 trade up, get $28,000 in return. I turned all that stuff down, so this is weird, and I turned it down. I mean, the opportunity, those influences did come, and I was just talking for the ticket. I guess that's the way it was. I was talking for the ticket.
What particularly do you think that decision that day, where basically your mother said to you, if you run from me, you're running to your death? Do you have any regrets in some ways that she was correct, or did you know that already?
Well, one of the things that
right.
is too little too late. After all the things that I've done to try to intervene, try to get her to understand what was happening over the years, it's too late. Now, as I said in Baton Rouge before we came towards Washington, D.C., I knew then that I was going to die, but I did not.
Well, when you mean right there, what do you mean? You were going to die?
I knew this was not going to end well.
Okay.
So this was not going to end well.
Did you at all think that this was going to be suicide by cop?
Yeah. It was like suicide by cop.
I mean, you think...
I was going to be, they were going to kill me. It was that thing. It was that thing.
But basically, you woke up and the car was so surrounded. They were pulling you out before you even woke up.
Surrounded. I woke up. I was outside the car. Inside the SUV. You didn't know what hit you. It was over with within a second. Literally within a second.
Did you believe it was happening?
I was still asleep.
Well, that's what I mean. Did you almost think it was a dream?
And then I saw these dudes come out the woods with the Remington rifles with these huge ass scopes that are in camouflage. You can see that.
Yeah, that would wake me up pretty quick.
Start coming out of the woods. Yeah, about 300 guys. Like, damn, this is real. It's real.
Or pretty serious crimes, I guess. So they had the big guns out. All from one guy seeing a license plate.
Yeah. Well, Holmes also played a big part. He is the one that contacted them and gave them the heat at the beginning. Because Muhammad had mentioned something like this to him a couple years ago. He said, what would happen to a metropolitan area if you had 3 snipers with suppressed weapons or even had what would happen? And Holmes remembered that and remembered the state John was in when he last saw him. And he called the FBI.
And about what time of year was this?
This was
July or something?
No, this was in the midst of the shooting.
Oh, okay.
This was in the midst of the shooting. He provided them some credible information as far as making silencers and different shootings and blah, 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 blah. Once they looked at the information, they started to see trail of it. It started to make sense. I mean, he thought, the reward was split between the truck driver and him. So he got $300,000, the truck driver got $300,000. He played a pivotal part. Without him, there would not have been a major investigation.
Okay, so another issue that's plagued me that you talked about is with regards to John. You said that John by himself, away from you, may have been a part of as many as 3 dozen murders. Is that true?
John is a very vengeful person. And based on some things he's told me what I've seen, I believe that. I mean, everyone, I think this one principle. If that man says something, you could count your life on it. Especially when it comes to vengeance. It was that serious. If you did something in, I'm sure it's 40 years later, you will not forget. and he will not forget.
So if he made a threat, he came through with it. Eventually.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is, he didn't make threats. He just held it all in, and when you want to know what he didn't make threats.
So separate from John himself, was with just the two of you, were there more than just the 10 to 12 that we know of in Washington and Arizona and Florida?
There's Washington, Arizona, Florida, Dallas. There's 6 between Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana. I mean, you have people. It's 29 shootings in total. 13 survived. Maybe either 9 or 13 survived. And there were a few other things. Well, it's actually more than that. It's actually more than that. There were these circumstances. In Maryland, there were 3 robbers.
Right.
One guy died and 2 survived. There were these often end robberies all over the place. Just with a handgun or something. There's more than that. There's more than that.
More than what?
In total, it's about 36. In total, it's about
36 with 9 to 11 surviving.
Correct.
And then, but that's apart from what you know of John.
Yeah.
So technically, John could be responsible for as many as 70 dead. You wouldn't put it past. You wouldn't put it past him.
I wouldn't put that.
Of all the people you've met over the last 10 years incarcerated, would you say John is among the most scary?
Yes. I mean,
as far as when he says he's going to do something, and I know a lot of people talk whatever in jail, and then they don't do anything. But
exactly.
But then John apparently he came through with his threats.
Correct. I mean,
that must have been awfully stressful on a daily basis just for you to be with him, knowing that. How did you feel safe?
I didn't fear him because he didn't. John violence and being control was just too. It was beneath him. That's the way he looked at things. John was very manipulative.
Well, we know that.
You can just more emotions are what drive people. If you understand what this person's desire and need is, these are the things you would tell them. It's just like an animal. You understand what it eats, where it goes. You understand how to track it. You understand its needs, its desires, where it's going, where it's coming from. It's not hard to track it. It's not hard to set it up. You just never corner that animal because it's dangerous. So, I mean, he would tell me exactly what he was doing to me while he was doing it. I just did not recognize it. He would use all these allegories and hunters. I mean,
well, you think that was a way of depersonalizing a victim to make, like you say, to make instead of a person, he called them a target. Do you think that was his way of doing that? Yeah.
He did that more 60 seconds. He did that more for me because I had greater, more compassion for this. He really didn't care. Once his mind was made up, he didn't care. They could do it over with. In order for him to rationally, these explanations were necessary in order for me to do the things he needs for me to do. He would twist the truth and twine it just enough to push me out the door. And then once the deed is done, it's too late. It's like digging a hole. The kid is the burden of waiting, and he just continues to use that against him. You'll have chat.
All right, I'll let you cool down here. I'll talk to you next week then.
All right.
Okay. Thanks for the 2 calls.
Okay, we're back. The audio quality did not really survive the Skype connection, but what I can do is I'm going to edit in the cleaned up version. We really worked hard on this all week long, getting this version really super duper clean. So I'll edit that in for the archives and for YouTube and stuff like that. But Anthony, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, a couple of questions for you.
Yes.
Now, at the end, when you're asking him about the number of murders, is he laughing?
Yes. He laughed several times.
Now, is that normal?
Now, if you noticed, like when we talked about the car being surrounded, he sort of laughed it off at 300 people. You know, he talked about, you know, the time of the shooting. Like, he sort of laughed off, you know, how 3 snipers being let out at the time of. I knew when it was, but I wanted to get him on record as saying, you know, it was during the time of the sniper shootings that. So that's what I'm talking about. Is like, and even that narcissistic comment where he said, you know, without those 2 tips, no major break would have ever happened in this case. Those are the kinds of things where if you say something erroneously, you let them, like, a good way of sort of judging a therapist is by having very few words and letting the person talk.
Right.
Like I don't say much in that 20 minutes. He's talking for 80% of it. I'm just trying to get, you know, sort of redirect him into the specific nature. But when he talks about the individual states, and then, you know, where he's talking about in Alabama, like where, you know, 3 robberies and 1 guy died, and it's like there's nothing there. There's no emotion. There's no, you know, 10 years removed from the shootings after allegedly, you know, receiving therapy or whatever it might be inside prison and having time to reflect on all the stuff that he had done. You know, regardless of the quality, I'm pretty sure that your viewer or your listeners, you know, could hear that there wasn't much there in terms of remorse.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about in your other conversations with him? Did he ever express remorse?
No. And when I visited him personally, he was probably more callous in 2012, even though we were releasing a book together. He thought the book was going to be, you know, he thought, you know, he was like Ted Bundy. His name was huge. He thought the book was going to sell millions of copies. And I explained to him that, you know, that's not how the world works today. There's 14 million books on Amazon alone. And I said, you know, true crime books don't sell the way they used to. And I said, you know, that's just not how things are. And I said, you know, there's no signing bonus with the publisher who I had or anything like that. That's just not how a lot of, you know, book publishers go these days. You know, the average book only sells 10,000 copies in its entire lifetime. And so he didn't like the statistics that I was providing to him. I wasn't allowed to bring anything in, but I was just telling him the facts. And he just thought, like, you know, I'm bigger than that. I'm huge, you know. And you know, it was more about the sales of the book he was concerned about than, you know, the emotional impact that it was supposed to provide. And so, you know, that was we spent 2 hours face to face, you know, sort of like between glass on the telephone kind of type interview.
Now, is he smiling or is he cold-blooded? What is his demeanor like?
No, I mean, in you know, psychological terms, you would say he had a blunted or almost flat affect, meaning he didn't have any emotion. There was nothing there.
Right.
There wasn't any shift that was noticeable that you would say, okay, I could put a finger on it and say, okay, you know, this guy realizes the gravity. I mean, it wasn't just the victims; it was all the terror he caused. Hundreds of thousands. I have people who I've met, you know, even as recently as last year, and they were like, you know, you wrote that book, like I lived through that. You know, it was terrifying. Like I still think about it when I park my car for gasoline. You know, I mean, you don't realize how psychologically he affected other people.
Yeah, the gas stations were putting up plastic tarps around the pump so that there wouldn't be a line of sight for their. Can you imagine? You know, they were lining up school buses. They were lining up school buses as buffers to bullets so that kids could enter schools. People were not even letting their kids go to school because a 13-year-old boy was shot. A 13-year-old was shot, right?
Yeah, a 13-year-old was shot in the stomach. So he survived, but amazingly survived. But only because he was only about 3 minutes from the hospital. Okay. So if he had been 20 minutes from the hospital, he would have bled to death.
Now, let me ask you a couple of specifics about the tape. Now, he talks about a shooting for hire. I believe it was in Arizona.
Right.
Do we know? Do we know?
A golfer on a golf course where and it's in my book. He details that murder. He details that murder in his diary in graphic detail. He's actually out there. He's almost sleeping on the golf course, waiting for this particular guy, and he shoots him and kills him. This is a true fact. I mean, this golfer did die in Arizona as a result of Lee Boyd Malvo. So, but it's sort of interesting where they talk about another alleged, murder for hire where, although he wasn't there, that, something may have happened in regards to a political assassination attempt in Florida. So, a lot of people tell me, well, DC snipers are spree killers and not serial killers. I would have to disagree because I call them serial snipers because if you look at the FBI's definition of 2 or more or 3 or more murders with time to cool between, you're talking about crimes that occurred obviously across the country with months, weeks, days in between to cool off before they even perpetuated the crime that would become known as the Beltway sniper shootings.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions. The Arizona shooting. Now, we know who the victim was. Do we have any idea who hired them?
We don't have any information other than the fact that Lee, as he sort of pointed out, he has spoken to authorities about it. I think some of that stuff, again, because he was a juvenile at the time, he never relayed to me in either a phone call, letter, email, or any other communication we had in either of those cases who hired them or why or for how much. Just the fact that they were murder for hire plots, which by themselves is somewhat interesting because, is that true? Is that something that we need to investigate? Or is it him being sort of narcissistic and just throwing it out there to sort of put a wrench in the whole system? But even so, it might be even more disturbing because what it shows is their ability to change their method of operation. This was not part of the quote system that they had going. Neither were these little petty robberies. The shootings in Washington, if you want to say ever made sense, those made sense because it looked like something where it went along with the, quote, Matrix-type plan, where everybody was against their system. But if you look at all the murders he just talked about, that completely defeats that idea.
Now, the murder for hire in Florida, the politician, do we know the name of that politician?
We don't, only because, again, he discussed it with the FBI. I do not believe a shot was ever taken.
Right.
I think it was something where John may have done something again where he said he was there, but he wasn't present, and John had done it on his own. I believe me, I did a lot of research on anything. I could not find. It was sort of interesting because when I said senator and he said state senator, I was sort of like, well, what other kind is there? But I didn't say that, of course. But
right.
I was trying to get at, I was trying to narrow him down to exactly who, was it a mayor, was it a senator, was it a, he says, state senator, which, you can narrow that down pretty easily. There's not many senators, and you can, but I never found anything that related to somebody being, saved or, a plot foiled by the police.
But
again, it's sort of interesting that, maybe in fact it did exist. I don't know. I've never heard it before, but you just did.
Yeah, but did you ever ask Malvo specifically if he knew the name of that guy or the name of the guy in Arizona or if he knew who hired them?
Well, the name of the guy in Arizona is in my book.
Okay.
That's specific. That's in my book. That entire thing is extremely detailed in Diary of the DC Sniper. It's step by step exactly what he did. Just like he talked about how if you know what the needs and desires are of a person, you can easily find them out. That's sort of what he's hinting at. If you find somebody's routine, and you know what they do, you can find out where they're going to be and what they're going to do, and it makes them an easy mark. That's really the rough thing that he's saying there. And so I don't want to disclose the name of the victim just because I don't want to, re-victimize the family. But
sure.
Again, if people want to find out the information, they can also find out online because it is online about the victim's name. But again, it's also detailed tremendously in my book about that particular murder.
Okay, but the Arizona murder is out there in the public. It's part of the official story.
Yeah, it's one. Well, it's part of the official story, but it's not part of the Beltway sniper shooting.
Right. Now,
which is sort of interesting.
And what about the? Yeah, I know. And you'd think you'd hear more about this. Now, what about the murder for hire in Florida of the politician? Is that part of the official story? Do they acknowledge this, or is this just only in your book?
I've never heard of anywhere else where that happened.
Now, what about when you asked Malvo these questions? Have you ever caught him directly in a lie, lying to you?
I mean, we all lie. I mean, we all tell a lie here or there. I mean, it's hard to know because I'm not his brother. I'm not his father. I don't know him. From. I mean, I've probably taken 6. As you can tell, he's very comfortable with me.
Yeah.
So we're talking like obviously this is not a first go at it. And I even say at the end, I said, I'll let you cool down here now. I mean, it's like, I was even late with that because usually the last 2 minutes of when somebody's that, they tell me that much information, I try and bring them down a little bit. But before I hang up the phone. But I think, the important thing to take away is that, what we heard was much more than we ever knew about the Beltway, the D.C. snipers. There's much more to that story.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of it was investigated, but, when they talk about his resentencing and the fact that, he's serving 6 life without parole prison terms. That's his current sentence. But they said that they took into consideration on this particular, remanding for possible resentencing, the fact that he expressed remorse for his crimes. I don't know if I hear that here at all. Now, granted, I didn't ask him specifically on my interview. I do ask him about remorse for his crimes. I do ask him specifically that very question. And, he gives his own answer to it, and whether or not you buy into it is up to, each individual listener. But I think for, the ability to cover his entire life in 66 minutes, which we do, I mean, you can see we cover a pretty good amount of information. That's why I take these phone calls. I mean, the average human being speaks 250 to 300 words in 1 minute. So in a single letter, that's 250 pages, 250 words per page, an average letter being maybe 2 or 3 pages. I can get that in 3 minutes on the phone.
All right.
So a conversation of 20 minutes is almost like a year's worth of writing to an inmate. So that's why I take these phone calls, because, I mean, it's amazing how much information you can get rather than, I mean, hello, how you doing? Hey, what's going on? I mean, that's what you're going to get in the letter versus what you just heard.
Now,
I mean, which would you rather hear?
No, this is great stuff. Now, we've only got about 10 minutes left, so a couple of questions now. You're not in contact with Malvo anymore. You had some kind of a falling out with him. What happened there?
Well, I mean, like with any relationship,
yeah.
I have some inmates who I've contacted on and off for 2 decades. Elmer Wayne Henley, for example, the Candyman killings, which happened in 1978. Actually, they happened in 1973. It was the biggest case until Gacy in 78. But Elmer Wayne Henley and I we've been writing and talking for actually almost over 20 years, just the two of us. And he calls me on occasion. It's not very often. He writes to me maybe 6 times a year. He'll send me a Christmas card or whatever. I talk to his mom. Those kind of things. But with Malvo, I mean, the relationship, like many, I mean, my relationship with Malvo probably outlasted most marriages these days. I mean, we went 8 years. We wrote a book. We did an interview together. I mean, we did about all you can do. I mean, we sort of reached the point to where there really wasn't anything more to do. I knew everything he had to give, and I did everything he asked me to do. So it just sort of, in a way, ran its course. It wasn't so much, it wasn't necessarily negative. It just, it just ran its course.
Okay. And in total, how many hours of tape recordings do you have with him in total?
Gee, I would say between 60 and 75 phone calls, maybe, something like that.
And it was about 20 minutes each, right?
My interview alone was four 20-minute phone calls just to get that done, edited down to make 66 minutes. So, right. I mean, just the interview with the DC sniper alone was 4 phone calls bridged together. So that was 80 minutes just right there. So, it's tough to say, but I would say we spoke on the phone anywhere from 60 to 80 times to be safe.
And in this interview with DC Sniper, you have about 70 minutes in there, you said, right?
Yeah, 66 minutes and change, because, CDs start to break down after 70 minutes, Now,
let me ask you this now. Considering all the murders and the shootings all across the country, have you been contacted by any cold case investigators or the FBI to wanting to know if you have any information, or you could contact him and talk to him as an intermediary, anything like that?
All the time.
Okay.
I actually went down to interview Glen Rogers after Glen Rogers sent their letter to them and said, the only person I'm going to talk to about this murder is Anthony Meoli. So they asked me to go down and talk to Glen Rogers about this particular murder, and I relayed the information back to them when I got done. And things like that. I'm working on 2 cold cases involving a serial killer in California, in Texas, and New Mexico, based exactly on these type of consensual phone calls. And I forward those calls to the detectives because it gives them, they don't have to take my word for it. And I've had them say, "Oh my God, this guy is telling me exactly what I need. I just need more." Having that kind of stuff is sort of gold for a cold case detective, because you're having the killer themselves admit to the crime. I'm sort of the medium for it. And I've had a lot of serial killers sort of laugh at the fact that, once they receive a death sentence, that they can say anything because they know they're never going to be tried in another state. So they don't have any qualms about talking to me about it, because they know they're not going to be pulled out of their jail cell to go serve another death sentence in, Texas. So that's why California is you're more likely to die of old age than you are going to die from the death sentence. I mean, nobody gets executed in California.
Yeah, you die from the food in there before you die from the.
Yeah, you die from the food or gangrene or something like that. But you're not going to die from the actual. It's a democratic state. Not to say anything good or bad, but typically Democratic states do not execute at the same rate as Republican states. It's just a fact.
But I meant specifically with Malvo. Have any cold case investigators come to you for Malvo?
No, I mean, shockingly, no. I mean, there's a lot of information out there about like I said, there's been movies, there's been other stuff made. Either people just don't do a lot of research, or they don't care to do the information. But I want to thank you for your platform, because I do think information, like, at the worst, if there is a case or a person or a family or a detective like yourself who wants to get information and never knew about it, I mean, wow, that's pretty interesting. I didn't know this information about whatever. That's sort of interesting. Maybe it was in fact tied to, the DC snipers. I don't know. Maybe they have the ballistic reports or what. I don't know. But those are the kinds of things where, sometimes a recording, might even be better than DNA, because it's providing you. He's telling you the states where they took the shots. He's telling you where they went. He's telling you what they did. And I'm not saying the words he is. If you had read that in a blog that I wrote, would you believe it? Versus hearing it from him and his mouth.
No, I hear you. What you got here is gold. And it doesn't surprise me too much because it seems like there's a lot of facts about this case, that the Nation of Islam, the gun running, this murder in Arizona, a politician murder down, all this stuff doesn't seem to ever been made it to the public awareness. And this story was covered 24/7. You know, it was 24 hours a day. So it's just fascinating. It seems to be like some cover-up someplace in this. Do you have that sense?
Well, I have the sense that, again, what, you know, I've experienced this, you know, over 25 years now of dealing with these inmates, is that, again, once they've been sentenced for their, you know, their quote big crime, and they're serving their sentence, they don't fear. Well, once I build a rapport with them and a trust, which takes, you know, years, it doesn't, you know, a phone call like that doesn't happen on your first phone call. You've got to build trust. But even to get consent to be recorded, which I cannot tell you how difficult it is to ease into the fact, like, hey, do you mind if I record your phone calls with a serial killer? That alone is an art in itself. I mean, to have somebody say, yeah, I don't care if you're recording my calls while I admit to murders. I mean, we can chalk up his phone calls being 100% fake, and he's just being, you know, a storyteller, or we can say, you know, parts of it are 100% true, like when he fell asleep and got caught, and 300 people descended. It wasn't quite 300, but it was about 100 people descended down on the car. That much is a fact. Take it a step further and say, you know, wow, there was a lot of information there about, you know, he's laughing off the fact that 36 murders with only 9 to 11 people surviving, you know, that puts them at 25 murders. That's a hell of a lot more than 10. You know, I'm not the person to investigate. I'm sort of the medium to get people the information, and it's my hope that that's, you know, I want to thank you for, you know, hearing me out.
Okay,
you know,
we only have
work.
We only got a couple of minutes left. So where can people find you? Do you have a website, or how we can find your books?
They can find me. It's called Meoli Forensic Consulting. It's you know, www.meoli Forensic Consulting, and it's they can. My phone number, my email, all that stuff information is on there. My phone number. I'm not you know, if somebody calls my cell phone, I'm going to pick up the cell phone. It's not like I'm a mystery person that, you know, doesn't, you know, the information's out there. You know, where I've appeared. I was on the Reels Network last weekend on Copycat Killers talking about this very case. So I mean, you know, I don't have things to hide. I share with people what I know because, you know, that's what I do. I sit on forensic panels and tell people and play these recordings of dozens of people who I talk to, so they know the same information I do. You know, it's not for shock value. It's for, you know, hopefully somebody somewhere listening can say, hey, you know, either I learned something from this, or I can take something forward and pursue it, and maybe help a family member or somebody come to, you know, an idea like this is what happened to your loved one. You know, that's really why I do what I do, because, you know, it's a very difficult subject to get into.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. This is important information, and the public does need to know this kind of information. If the FBI is talking to this guy about these other paid for hits and is a politician, people need to know this stuff. You know, and if he's admitted to 30 murders and the other one did 70 murders, and even the judge isn't even looking at this stuff, this is news that has to get out there. Very important. So I can't thank you enough. Anthony Meoli, and his website is meoliforensicsconsulting.com. We're out of time. Anthony, thank you so much. I'm going to be in touch with you during the week. Okay, my friend?
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, bye-bye.
Anthony Meoli. MeoliForensicConsulting.com. His books are Diary of a DC Sniper and Interview of a DC Sniper. It's a recording tape. You can find it on Amazon and iTunes. Now, everybody, calm down. I'm going to fix... I have a pristine audio copy that Vin over at People's Internet Radio did for me. A pristine audio copy that we got all the hiss out. It just didn't survive the Skype connection, but I hear the version over on American Freedom Radio came up pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take either, if the one on American Freedom Radio sounds good, I'll take that and I'll put that on YouTube. I'll put that on the archives. Everybody will have it. Don't worry. Everybody can come down. Okay. And if not, I will personally edit the whole thing myself. The way I do it, it takes me like 4 hours. Okay, forget it. Because I got to do it. I don't know how to do this stuff. But I could pull it up. So that was Anthony Meoli, Forensic Consulting. MeoliForensicConsulting.com is his website. Check that out. You can buy a copy of this book there or Amazon and iTunes. We're going to have him back about Glen Rogers, who's that prolific serial killer that many people believe is connected to the that guy Bill Deere, believes connected to the OJ case. So when I asked Anthony about that case, he just went off on the phone with me for like 20, 25 minutes. I couldn't even get a word in edgewise. So he has a ton of information about that. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget we have the members section. I got all different kinds of content in there. I just did an interview with Johnny Vedmore. That's great, and everyone's all excited about it. I barely even have it up yet. It's not even in the members section yet. I just had it up on YouTube for $2 on YouTube, but everybody's flipping out. They can't get in the Netherlands. And this guy must be a big deal. It's about Theresa May and how her father was associated with a serial killer over there in the UK. Got another guy I'm doing this, author in the UK. I think his name is Litchfield. John Litchfield, his name is. Another popular guy. And he just came out with this detailed story about how Robert De Niro was involved in this prostitution ring in the UK. And what do you call it? They were also trafficking children, too. So there's a connection to Robert De Niro. I'm going to have Jeff Gilson on Tuesday. I'm taping with him on Tuesday about we had him on before about Maggie's Hammer. It's all this stuff about I could talk to him about Robert Maxwell. He knows about Robert Maxwell. He's got a connection to him. But we're going to be talking about Trump and Trump's connection to Khashoggi. He wrote this thing on Facebook. It's great content. We're going to have him on. I'm going to be taping with him on Tuesday and probably play it on a Friday night. And then Monday I'm taping with Melinda Kula. Everybody loves her about her theory about the JonBenet Ramsey story, okay? And she has this suspect in mind. She's like an eyewitness to it. She's great content there, too, as well. Even Jim Rothstein's gotten involved in that case, people who are familiar with Jim Rothstein. But to keep the show on the air, we need the members section supported. I got cheap deals. You go there right now to OppermanReport.com, and you can get a free book. If you sign up for a year, $74 for a year, I send you a free autographed copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. The first chapter is a little biography about my life. Coming after this is William Ramsey. Second part of his interview with FBI agent D'Souza. I forget what case D'Souza's involved in. I can't think right now. I got so much on my mind. And then after that, we have John Barber interviewing John Potash, one of our favorite guests over here, John Potash, John Barber's World after that. Okay, guys, boys and girls, I love you so much. Don't forget the members section. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the show. I apologize about that audio quality, but I'm going to, if in the archives and the YouTube, don't panic. I promise you it's going to be fine. Okay? Thank you so much, guys. Good night.